Everybody, welcome. We have a special guest. You might recognize her from her previous appearance on this show. She's a great journalist doing some really great reporting that's coming out of Syria. Not many reporters are actually even going to Syria. She's one of the few, and she's given us the truth about what's been happening in Syria. She's an independent journalist from Canada. Please welcome my guest, Eva Bartlett. Hi, Eva. How are you?
Hi, Jimmy. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
So now you really did some groundbreaking reporting on this. Can you just tell briefly what's the biggest misconceptions that people have who, if they've been watching the mainstream media, what would be their biggest misconceptions about what's happening in Syria?
That there's something called a civil war or some entity called rebels in Syria that are fighting against this caricaturized evil regime that is gunning down his people and gassing his people. And I mean, some of the latest lies do revolve around chemical weapons allegations. So the main mythology is that this is all about a popular uprising against the president.
But it's not a popular uprising against the president because it was the CIA and lots of other outside actors, correct, that fomented this through the Arab Spring. Then they kind of brought in outside actors, meaning people supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the CIA also. Is that correct? Is that what's really been happening?
Absolutely. And I mean, you have documents from the mid-2000s, you have documents even from the 80s when prior attempts at regime change were enacted. But even taking like this current attempt at regime change, I would highly recommend a Canadian author named Stephen Gowans, who wrote a very thorough article called The Revolutionary Distemper in Syria That Wasn't. And the reason I recommend him is that he links to, well, he gives a lot of historical context. He links to these documents and also to actual, surprisingly, corporate media reporters who were on the ground in early 2011 and who were reporting prior to March 2011, which is what we're told were the revolution, the so-called Arno protests kicked off. He was citing corporate media, New York Times, Time magazine, saying, actually, there's not much will for protest here.
Oh, no kidding. I will check that out. Thanks for the heads up on that. I know that I played on this show a video of an interview between Christian Amanpour from CNN with Assad from 2005, where she was warning him that everybody wanted to overthrow him already and that regime change was the word of the day from the West. So what do you, I wasn't really following the news back then, 12 years ago, that closely, is certainly not as it related to Syria. But do you know what the justification back in like 2005 was that the United States and the West was giving for regime change in Syria back then?
Likewise, like yourself, I wasn't following the news, and I fully admit, back then I was utterly apolitical. But I mean, the documents that trace back, to after September 11th, and even prior to, again, referring to Gowan's article, he gets into how the Washington or the West did not like the socialist Ba'athist government in Syria. And so they had desire to implement a new government which would, acquiesce to their demands on, allowing different international companies in there, extracting oil and natural resources, ending Syria's long-standing support for Palestinians, and support for Hezbollah and other allies, and having Syria make peace with Israel, which is occupying the Syrian Golan and which has warred upon, including recently, many times, Syria. Related to the 2000s, we have the famous kind of speech by General Wesley Clark saying Syria was on the hit list along with 6 or 7 other nations. And there's other documentation, again referring to Gowan's article, that after September 11th, Syria was put on the hit list, the so-called axis of evil, or whatever, cartoonish words they were using back then. Certainly, and this is something I think most cognizant people would recognize, it has nothing to do with freedom, democracy, or human rights in Syria, particularly when you consider currently, and since 2011, the allies of the West, the ones that have been funding and funneling in terrorists into Syria, be they Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel.
So so what got you interested in covering Syria? How did that come about? Because a lot of people have been, since you're actually reporting facts that counter the mainstream established news media and our government, people have been impugning your character all over the place. And so just tell everybody here now what got you interested in Syria, and how did you come about to go there?
Sure. I would just note first, I think that if I towed the line, used the rhetoric of the corporate media and the NATO propagandists, including Amanpour, people would be celebrating me and I'd be wealthy. But because I'm reporting as I see it and I don't have an agenda and nobody's paying me to say what I say, I am being vilified, as you're surely aware. But basically, when things were kicking off in Syria, I had no prior knowledge of Syria. I had no misconceptions or preconceptions about Syria. And I was living in Gaza, in occupied Palestine at the time, doing activism there, trying to bring awareness to the, truly horrifying plight of Palestinians under brutal siege and random bombings and massacres. But so, that said, when things started in 2011, I was also enduring the same power outages as Palestinians in Gaza. I wasn't well informed, but at some point in 2011 and 2012, I started paying very close attention, reading a variety of sources, consulting friends and analysts who I respected, and felt like something was really wrong with what we were being told was happening in Syria. In March 2013, I left Gaza finally and went back to Canada. I started asking Syrian Canadians. And their replies to my questions on what was happening in Syria were very interesting, because many of them said, when things started in 2011, we were hopeful. We wanted change. We wanted political change in Syria. Some of us went back to Syria and supported the demonstrations. But very quickly on, they and people in Syria that I later encountered and interviewed said, what we saw was not political change. These were brutal protests. These were thuggish protests, not demanding actual political reforms. So, knowing what I was hearing from people I trusted in Canada, and then going in 2014, April 2014, for my first time to Syria, hearing a narrative that was in stark contrast to what we were being told by corporate media, really, I'm sure like yourself, motivated me to do as much as possible to shed some truth on really a vacuum of, lies and manufactured media around Syria.
So if those protests didn't want political change, those thuggish protests that we now find out, many of them were outside agitators, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, people being funded by the CIA, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So now, what were the point of those thuggish protests if they weren't for political change?
Well, I mean, some of the initial protests did call for certain things like the end to the emergency law in Syria, the release of political prisoners. And this is an important note, because these so-called political prisoners included people who were active in the 80s, including Muslim Brotherhood people. And many of these so-called political prisoners went on to join the so-called rebels and have become violent leaders or part of these different Al-Qaeda affiliated or Al-Qaeda, working with Al-Qaeda groups. Some of the other demands included the lifting of certain laws that pertain to Syria's, and this is, sorry, Jimmy, but this is why I do refer back to the Stephen Gowan's article, because he gives the context of decades prior, what was happening, the various attempts of CIA coups d'etats, Syria being at war with Israel, and the fact that, yes, it was an authoritarian government, but there are reasons for it. And meanwhile, and this is something I heard from Syrians themselves, they had free education, free healthcare. They were one of the safest countries. Life was affordable, and all of that has been devastated by this foreign war and sanctions on Syria.
Well, we already know, and we've reported on this show, it's well documented that the CIA, acting at the behest of the United States, is not a fan of democracy anywhere. What they really want, what the CIA does, and we know this all the way back from General Smedley Butler, who wrote about this and the Banana Wars and all the stuff that happened in South America, is that what the United States does is they go and if there is a government that's socialist, like you say, and they want to keep their natural resources for their own people, instead of giving it to a corporation from the West, what we'll do is send our Marines down there and our CIA, undermine their sovereignty, their government, overthrow them, install a right-wing strongman who is then favorable to our corporations, and then we extract their natural resources and wealth from that country. That's basically what's been happening. And so we've been trying to overthrow Syria since the 50s, right? That's not a secret, right? I think even the CIA admits that they did that. That's right when they overthrew Iran, which also had a democratically elected president. They overthrew him. Why? Because he wanted to spread democracy across the Middle East, and the CIA likes strong-armed theocracies like Saudi Arabia because you can count on them to do the bidding of corporate America. You can't count on democracies to do the bidding of corporate America. So that's why the CIA, that's why they don't like democracies. That's why they don't like socialism. That's why they don't like leaders who take the resources of their country and give it back to their own people. And what's happening in Syria also, I don't know if you've reported on this part of it, but we have, is that they're trying to send a natural gas pipeline to Europe, and that natural gas is going to come from Qatar. And so that's why Russia doesn't want Syria to be overthrown, because they don't want to have that competition for selling fossil fuels to Europe that's going to come from Saudi Arabia. Now, have you heard about that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think Israel is also involved in this Qatari pipeline. And certainly Russia has its own, geopolitical and its own other interests. But the bottom line in terms of Russian involvement in Syria is that they were invited by the Syrian government to participate in fighting terrorism.
Right.
And the American-led coalition was not invited, and their presence in Syria is illegal. And not only that, they've attacked Syrian civilians, they've attacked Syrian army posts, including September 2016. And some days after that, there was a manufactured incident of a convoy being attacked, and it turned out it was done by one of the terrorist factions. And this illegal attack, murdering between 60 and 80 or more Syrian soldiers and enabling ISIS to take over in Dore, was suddenly non-existent. And the Americans never apologized for it. And there have been many incidents of them attacking Syrian positions. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the pipelines being one of the major reasons, yes. But Israeli involvement is also another major reason.
Yes, there's not just... Go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's staggering. I mean, there's actually so many statements, declarations from Israeli leadership themselves saying, well, actually, we have no problem with these Al-Qaeda, ISIS terrorists. No, they're the lesser evil. Well, that's why they're treating them in their hospitals. That's why they're funneling them in and out of Syria via the occupied Syrian Golan. So, and that's why it's attacking Syria so many times.
Are you surprised at how easily propaganda works on America? Are you surprised at the ubiquity of the forwarding of the government message, which is really the military-industrial complex message? It just gets repeated by the mainstream media in the United States ad nauseum without any critical. I mean, no one. They're sitting there. They're literally gushing, emotionally gushing over missiles taking off to go bomb people in another country. Is that shocking to you? And how do other people around the world see the U.S. media's coverage of this?
I guess sadly to me it's not shocking, because I've been very focused on Syria and Palestine and Yemen, which nobody talks about, and which Saudi Arabia is massacring for a number of years. So the hypocrisy of the media and these Western leadership statements or things that go on in the United Nations don't surprise me. They gross me out intensely. But when you consider how much, I think you talk more regularly and you know more about ownership of the corporate media and who's really funding or what agenda they have. However, I mean, even when somebody off radar speaks out, if they say something that does not align to this message, then they will be smear campaigned. And the general public, I really don't blame them. I mean, you would expect that they would remember the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador who cried about incubator babies and pretended to be a nurse, but they don't. You would expect they'd remember the lies about Gaddafi's troops on Viagra raping people, and they don't. And there's so many manufactured lies in all the various conflicts, or otherwise known as invasions, in the recent decade or two or more, that people should know about. But, I think that if there were more Jimmy Dores out there, maybe people would be more aware. But, when people are reading from a script, literally reading from a script about the latest atrocities in Syria, then the public will be, remain ignorant. And when human rights groups, so-called, which are really many of them the arm of the State Department or other, nations, but Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, when they are bleating the same chorus, the same lies, when Ken Roth is tweeting about Aleppo and it's actually Shijayi Gaza, or it's another area of Syria, or it's an area that's been destroyed or attacked by the precious rebels, and when Amnesty International claims that they have evidence about torture in a prison called Saydnaya, but they have no researchers on the ground, and they grossly overestimate the even possible numbers that could have been in that complex. But people believe these things. I mean, it's a very large and uphill battle we're fighting in our efforts to educate people. So no, I'm not surprised, but I am disgusted.
I am surprised, actually, because I lived through the Iraq War here. And we all figured, Hillary Clinton didn't win the election in 2008 against Barack Obama because of the Iraq War, and she was for it. People are sick and tired of these wars. Donald Trump got elected partly on the basis of that he's a non-interventionist, that his whole thing is that we're getting bogged down in the Middle East and we should get the hell out of there. And that's a reason why a lot of people voted for him. And you see what just happened. Within 100 days, the military-industrial complex got their hands on him, and they turned him just that quickly. And he's bombing again, and he's bombing in everywhere now, about Yemen and Syria, and he's provoking North Korea, and he's doing everything he can possibly do that the military-industrial complex wants, because he wants to keep America pretty scared, so we keep spending way more money than ever necessary on our military, which is what's happening. It's working perfectly, and they got rid of the draft. We used to have a draft in the United States, which got people out protesting against wars, but they got rid of that, and they just made everybody so poor that they can't afford college, so now you have to go into the military if you want to go to college or get a decent job. So that's how they do it, and nobody protests that because that's just capitalism. So tell me a little bit more about the white helmets, because I have a feeling that they're not on the up and up. Are they?
Well, I have to commend a dear friend and colleague of mine, Vanessa Beeley, who's really done, so much in-depth research. Many of us have researched, but she very doggedly pursued this myth of these so-called rescuers in Syria. White helmets were founded in 2013 by a British ex-military officer. They've been funded by well over $100 million, according to different public records, by Western nations. Their main line is that they are rescuing civilians in Syria, presumably from Syrian and or Russian atrocities. And they claim to be volunteers and neutral, but by now, we've seen so many, not only their Facebook and social media accounts showing them, in one instance wearing a white helmet, in another instance holding a weapon or firing a cannon, but also there are instances of them actually wearing the white helmets and standing with Al-Qaeda or ISIS flags, terrorist flags. And then furthermore, when I was in Aleppo last time, it was November 2016, my fourth time to Aleppo. And while I didn't at that time go to East Aleppo because it wasn't yet liberated, I did meet people from East Aleppo who had fled the presence of these terrorists, including al-Nusra, including Al-Qaeda in Syria, including the various factions that the West says are moderates. These two families that I interviewed said they'd tried many times to flee before, and they were prevented from fleeing by these different terrorist factions who were hoarding food and medicine and giving in medical treatment only to their own. When I asked about the white helmets, these people had never heard of them. Later, Aleppo was liberated, eastern areas of Aleppo. And so, again, Vanessa Beeley was on the ground there interviewing people. And then later on, a number of other independent people. Pierre Lecorf, a Frenchman living in Aleppo for the last year. He also has done a lot of documentation. And he, Vanessa, and Carla Ortiz, a Brazilian actress, I believe she's Brazilian, sorry about that, I might get that wrong, but Bolivian. But many people have gone to these areas, including the White Helmets headquarters. And guess what, Jimmy?
What?
The White Helmets headquarters is littered with Al-Qaeda and ISIS slogans and flags. And Islamic, and I don't mean normal Islam, I mean these extremist Wahhabi, Takfiri Islam, paraphernalia and slogans. And so that, the claim that these white helmets are neutral, given all these facts, is completely laughable. And then the fact that they only operate in Al-Qaeda and other terrorist areas. And then, as I'll just take this moment, if I may, Jimmy, just to clear one thing up. In the UN press press conference panel that you probably have seen, I said a number of things. And, some of these vulture media that, issue their own articles or fact checks on me went after 2 points, totally negating the points I made about the 1.5 million people suffering under terrorist bombings and snipings for many years, and the various other points I made in 25, 30 minutes. The 2 points they focused on, one, I will admit, I'm human and I didn't articulate as well as I could have. So the one is about children possibly being recycled. So I will say I cannot prove that this one particular child has been recycled, sometimes called Aya. What I can say is the white helmets have participated in faking media. And there are many examples, including the so-called mannequin challenge. And also, not only the white helmets, but these various dubious media sources like the Aleppo Media Center, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and even a group of filmmakers in Egypt were arrested making a film purporting to be in Aleppo under Assad's bombs. So what my main point was, and I should have articulated better, was that we need to be very careful and very, we need to question the media we're being presented. And the other point was that I mentioned the Al-Quds hospital. My only error there was in saying that it hadn't been hit, because I cannot prove it wasn't hit, but it was not reduced to rubble as the MSF or Doctors Without Borders stated.
So why would I saw that. Why would the Doctors Without Borders state that it was reduced to rubble if it hadn't been?
Because they were relying on their sources on the ground, which happened to be terrorist-affiliated doctors or these various independent, unnamed activists. Okay. I know many people, including a doctor from Aleppo, Dr. Nabil Antaki, who speaks excellent English and French, who went to the Al-Sukri district where Al-Quds Hospital is located, and it's still standing. Vanessa Beeley went there. Pierre Lecorf went there. Various other independents have gone there. It's still standing. It wasn't reduced to rubble, and there's no way in hell, even if it had been reduced to rubble, that it was rebuilt. So I've documented.
It's amazing that. So I saw the press conference you're talking about. That's when I first became aware of you, and that's when we first covered all this stuff. And it was through your reporting, your firsthand reporting on the ground, right? Which no one else is doing, and that's what you're exposing. That these people are just reporting everything second and third hand. There aren't any human rights, and the people who are the white helmets on the ground there, you're saying started by British military, and they get funded. So I've seen all the disinformation in the mainstream media, and we show how they report it. And we show how when they call them rebels when they're in Syria, and they're called terrorists when they're in Iraq. And
yes.
And we showed how we funded Al Qaeda when we called them anti-Soviet freedom fighters, anti-Soviet, and then they turned into Osama bin Laden, who then attacked us, and now they're the worst people in the world who cut people's heads off with knives. But remember, Eva, we use good Christian bombs that don't blow up babies or women. It dodges them, and it finds just soldiers, and it hugs them to death. That's the way there's only certain ways you can kill people, and you have to use a Christian bomb made in America by a good Christian.
Well, some of these are also, Al-Qaeda bombs made in Syria using gas canisters stuffed with explosives and shrapnel and fired on civilian populations. But our media doesn't seem to think that's significant.
At all.
Just before I forget, because I already did, there's these two villages named Fu and Kafraya, and they're in western Syria, in Idlib. And I'm sure you heard about the convoy that was attacked.
Yes.
And media had different reports in the numbers, but sources on the ground in Aleppo were saying 200 civilians, of whom 116 children. And one of those sources was an Aleppo MP, and others were people that Vanessa, who's back in Syria, Vanessa Lee, she took testimonies of civilians who had survived that massacre. Really sadistic massacre, and I think some important points are, our media described it as a hiccup.
Yeah, we covered that. I saw it. I saw the CNN guy. So it's going to keep going on, these evacuations, after this hiccup. He literally said that, a hiccup, the slaughter of 116 children, 200 people. When it's done by people who we're supporting, it's called a hiccup. But when it's
Right,
done,
and-
but when it's done by people we're opposed to, we have to bomb them because we're humanitarians.
And the thing is, it followed a week or two after the alleged, still unproven gas attacks. Unproven in the sense we don't know, we cannot prove, and it's highly unlikely that the Syrian government or Russians did it. It's far more likely that the so-called rebels, otherwise known as terrorists in Syria, did it. They have a history of doing so. They have possession of the only chlorine factory, as documented by Time, even back in 2012 or 13. And they have, as documented by Seymour Hersh, access to sarin, thanks to Turkey and other agents. And it's not in Syria's interest to use gas attacks when they can use conventional bombs to fight terrorists. But just a week or two after, I forget the chronology, there's a sick, savage attack on civilians, mostly women, children, elderly, and ill, leaving Fu and Kafraya, where they've been besieged since March 2015, denied food, denied medical care, truly besieged, not like all this crap they were talking about, Aleppo or Ghouta or now Idlib, truly besieged, truly suffering, and these people are attacked. And that's a hiccup.
And that's a hiccup, and that's how. So we've seen the Western media's just blatant lies, right? So the whole thing is a big lie about why we're, you ask people, why are we in Syria? And people, they don't even, I mean, in America, when I ask people, why do you think we're in Syria? And they always kind of pause like, wow, I never thought about it. It's hilarious. Why are we there? We're there because of Western imperialism at the behest of the petrodollar. That's why we're there.
Yeah.
Eva, we have to say goodbye right now, but you're on your way back to Syria, correct?
I am, yeah. I should be there in the near future.
Okay, so good luck. Please stay safe, and I hope you check back in with us if you can. Whenever you can, let us know. And if you have an update and you want to get the message out, we'll certainly let people know.
And Jimmy, I just have to say thank you for using your platform and your humor and your intelligence to actually share the truth, because it's been immensely frustrating to see the lies. So really, thank you so much for what you're doing.
I appreciate, you're the one who's really doing the courageous stuff. I'm just sitting here in my studio. So you're doing the work. You're actually on the ground, and I'm just re-reporting the stuff that you're actually letting people know. And if it wasn't for you, nobody would know anything. So Eva Bartlett, do you have a website or anything that we can tell people to go to, our blog?
Yeah, I have my old blog from my Gaza days. It's ingaza.wordpress.com.
Okay. Everybody check it out, and we'll have you back on as soon as you have some new stuff to report from Syria. Eva Bartlett, thank you very much.